The clerk humiliated an elderly black woman right in the boutique. She didn't even realize her son was a billionaire and owner of this store. Subscribe. Tell me in the comments what city you're from. The morning sunlight spilled softly through the lace curtains in Ruth Johnson's modest Harlem apartment. It filtered across the time-worn floorboards and settled on the collection of framed photographs lining the wall above a small oak table. In each picture, a younger Ruth stood with a warm, steady smile, sometimes holding a boy with searching eyes, sometimes beside an older woman who looked strikingly like her, their arms interlinked. The table below was neatly arranged, a single fresh lily in a vase, a worn Bible with a fabric bookmark, and a black velvet pouch tied with a ribbon. It was that pouch she reached for now. 70-year-old Ruth moved with quiet precision. Her steps were slow but certain, her hands weathered but graceful. She chose her outfit with care, a cream-colored blouse buttoned to the neck, a navy cardigan with loose sleeves, and a matching skirt that brushed her ankles. Her shoes were polished flats with faint scuff marks at the toes. The ensemble was dignified, simple, and told no lies about her station in life. In the mirror, she adjusted a pair of pearl earrings, gifts from her sister May, given decades earlier on a Christmas morning neither of them could forget. They'd made a promise then. Each milestone, each hard-earned celebration, they would honor themselves with something beautiful. May was gone now. 5 years had passed, but Ruth still honored the vow. Today was the anniversary of her sister's birth. It was time to buy something small yet radiant in her memory. She untied the black ribbon of the pouch. Inside were 3 gold coins, each polished until the engraved Liberty heads shone like tiny suns. These had once belonged to her father. She had kept them all her life, untouched, but now she would part with one. Not out of loss, but reverence. As she stepped into the hallway, her keys and pouch tucked securely in her handbag, Ruth paused and whispered a few words beneath her breath. Not a prayer exactly, but a moment of silence with the memory of a sister who had once called her the strongest woman she knew. Then she descended the stairs, her grip light on the railing, and stepped into the crisp air of the waking city. The subway was crowded as always. Ruth clutched the chrome pole near the car door and watched the people around her. Some were glued to their phones, eyes flicking with each scroll. Others wore headphones, sealed inside sound. A child leaned against her mother's leg, chewing on a cracker and staring at Ruth with curious eyes. Ruth smiled gently. The mother didn't notice. The train jostled at each stop. Faces shifted, bodies swayed. Ruth remained still. She had learned long ago how to disappear into crowds, how to breathe in spaces where people rarely saw her unless they needed something. She had no bitterness about it. It was simply part of living. But today, she hoped to be seen, even for a moment. When she emerged in Midtown, the sun was higher and the city louder. Glass towers stretched toward the clouds. Flags fluttered above high-end storefronts. Taxis honked in a slow procession. She moved deliberately through the sidewalks until she reached the broad, arched doorway of Cortland and Finch, a luxury jewelry boutique known across Manhattan. Ruth paused at the entrance, letting her fingers tighten briefly on her handbag strap. The boutique's name was etched in gold leaf across black marble, guarded by chrome railings and a sharply dressed doorman who nodded but did not greet her. She nodded in return and entered. Inside, it was cool and bright, a quiet hush preserved like a chapel's. Spotlights bathed glass display cases. Crystals dangled from chandeliers. Soft, classical music drifted from hidden speakers. The perfume of polished wood and expensive colognes hung in the air like an invisible veil. Every surface gleamed. Every movement was deliberate. Ruth stood for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the light. Behind the long, curved counters stood employees in dark suits and pristine blouses, their name tags small and discreet, their smiles practiced. They moved like dancers across the marble floor, fluid, efficient, precise. But none approached her. She stepped closer to a display case featuring sapphire necklaces. A man and a woman beside her were examining diamond tennis bracelets, their shopping bags emblazoned with designer logos. They didn't acknowledge Ruth's presence. She turned toward another case where rings of all cuts sparkled like stardust under the lights. Then she saw it. A ring of yellow gold with a modest emerald nestled in a fluted bezel, simple and elegant, not loud, not grand, just true. Ruth's fingers hovered above the glass. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "Can I help you?" Ruth looked up. The speaker was a young woman in her 30s, with sleek blonde hair swept into a glossy knot and a flawless coat of lipstick that matched the red on her nails. Her blouse was silky, tucked into a pencil skirt that hugged her hips. Her expression was pleasant but perfunctory. She looked Ruth up and down with an assessing gaze that barely hid its question. Ruth offered a quiet smile. "Yes, dear. I'd like to see that emerald ring, please." The woman, her name tag read Courtney, blinked. "This one?" She pointed. Ruth nodded. "If it's not too much trouble." Courtney's smile didn't reach her eyes. She tapped something on the glass with manicured fingers and turned. As she walked to retrieve a key, she passed another associate and exchanged a glance. The glance said enough, "Watch her." Ruth felt it like a cold wind. She stood quietly as Courtney returned, unlocked the case, and placed the ring onto a velvet tray. Ruth took a step forward and gently picked it up. It was heavier than she expected, solid and warm in her fingers. She lifted it toward the light. The emerald caught the beams and refracted green fire. It reminded her of May's birthstone. She turned it gently, smiling inwardly. Her thumb brushed the inner band. Her vision blurred, not with tears, but with memory. Behind the counter, Courtney shifted. "I'll need you to be careful with that," she said. "It's quite valuable." Ruth's brow lifted slightly, but she nodded. "Of course." She continued her inspection for a moment longer, then carefully placed the ring back on the tray. Courtney hesitated. Then she picked up the ring and stared at it. Her expression darkened. "This isn't right," she said. Ruth looked at her, puzzled. "I beg your pardon?" Courtney's tone changed. It grew sharp, clipped. "This isn't the same ring. This isn't the one I gave you." Ruth blinked. "Excuse me?" Courtney held up the ring for another associate to see. "She must have swapped it," she said, louder now. "This is a fake." Heads turned. A customer paused mid-conversation. Another staff member frowned and began walking toward them. Ruth felt the room tilt slightly. Her fingers gripped the edge of the counter. She began, but Courtney was already gesturing toward a man in a dark suit. Security. She switched the ring. I handed her the original, and this isn't it. The security guard approached. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to check your bag," he said. "No," Ruth said softly. "I haven't done anything wrong." Courtney snatched the tray from the counter. "You can't just come in here and—" "That's enough," said the security guard, raising a hand. Customers were watching. Someone pulled out a phone. Ruth stood still. Her eyes were wide, but not with panic. With something else. Pain. Old, familiar, and deeply rooted. Her chest rose and fell slowly. She set her hand on her handbag and stepped back from the counter. "I didn't take anything," she said. Courtney narrowed her eyes. "Then what's that in your hand?" "My keys." Security didn't find anything, but Courtney's words had done their damage. Ruth could feel it in the air. The suspicion, the judgment, the bitter unspoken words everyone had learned to dress in civility. She straightened her shoulders. "I'll go," she said, and turned. No one stopped her. No one apologized. As she walked past the polished glass doors, out into the noise of the street, the memory of her sister's laughter flickered behind her eyes. And for the first time in years, Ruth felt something inside her fracture. Not from what was done, but from how easily it had happened. She did not look back. The subway ride home felt heavier than the ride in, not because the car was more crowded or the hour more intense, but because Ruth Johnson carried something invisible now, something bruised but intangible. She sat in the end seat of the train, pressed gently into the corner, her handbag nestled in her lap. Her eyes were cast downward, focused on her gloved hands folded neatly above the pouch that once held the gold coins. She had returned them to it, untouched. The promise to May, at least today, would go unfulfilled. Around her, New York moved in its usual indifference. Two teenagers laughed too loudly at a video playing on a cracked phone screen. A woman in scrubs leaned back against the window, eyes closed, the exhaustion of a long shift carved into her posture. A man in a suit argued into a Bluetooth headset. None of them noticed Ruth. None saw the way her throat fluttered with a withheld sob, or the way her spine remained perfectly straight, as though it alone carried the weight of dignity she refused to drop. She exited the subway at 125th Street and walked the 6 blocks to her apartment without pausing. The air was cold. Wind scratched at her skin. Her legs ached with each step. At the front stoop, she reached for the railing and pulled herself slowly up the stairs. She didn't realize she had been holding her breath until she unlocked the door and stepped inside. Her apartment greeted her with silence. She closed the door, hung up her coat, placed her shoes on the mat, and moved into the small living room where sunlight no longer shone. She didn't turn on a light. She sat down on the couch, her hands still in her lap, and stared at the table across the room. The lily in its vase had begun to wilt. Minutes passed, then hours. She didn't cry, not yet. The moment was too raw for that. It lived not in the theatrical outpouring of tears, but in the quietness of being seen as less than human. What stung wasn't just the false accusation, though that had its own venom. It was the memory of the faces watching, the other customers, the staff, the security. All silent, none intervening. The way the world had pivoted against her with such seamless precision, as though trained for it. As though society kept that mechanism oiled and ready, just in case someone like her dared to reach above her station. Eventually, she rose. She placed the pouch of coins back into the drawer of the nightstand beside her bed. Then, with trembling fingers, she opened a carved wooden box and pulled from it a bundle of letters tied in navy ribbon. She sat down again, this time at the kitchen table, and untied the ribbon. The letters were from her son. Not her son by blood, but hers in every way that mattered. Jason. She had found him in a rainstorm on a February night, crying beside a bench near the Morningside Park playground. He was 3 years old. His mother, strung out and desperate, had left him with a promise to return. She never had. Ruth had taken him home, wrapped him in blankets, fed him soup. She called every shelter, filed every report. No family came. In the end, after months of court visits and interviews, he became hers. Letter after letter, written in tidy print at first and then in cursive, traced the years of their life together. From his first summer at camp, "I miss your cornbread, Mama Ruth," to his college acceptance letter, "You made this possible," to the final one she had received on her birthday a year ago, "The world is only big enough for me because you taught me not to fear it." She ran her fingers along the paper. She could picture his handwriting still, the bold strokes of confidence, the crooked loops of youth. She didn't want to burden him with what happened. Jason was busy, important, a businessman now. She had always kept her world separate, believing it was her duty not to pull on the fabric of the life she had helped him build. But tonight, something shifted. She folded the letters back into their ribbon, replaced them in the box, and stood at the window. Outside, the city glowed and trembled. Sirens sang in the distance. A taxi honked. Someone shouted. A dog barked once. Life continued, uncaring, but inside her, a quiet resolution began to form. She made herself a cup of tea, the motion familiar, grounding. She didn't touch it. Instead, she pulled a small notebook from her shelf, one she rarely used. Its pages were blank. Slowly, she began to write. "Today, I was accused of theft. Not by a stranger on the street, but by a woman in a fine blouse in a place full of lights and glass and silence. She saw my skin and decided she knew my story. She looked at my hands and thought them unworthy of beauty. She believed I would trade my dignity for a stone." She paused. Her pen trembled. She was wrong. That night, Ruth lay in bed, unable to sleep. Each time she closed her eyes, the scene replayed. The accusatory voice, the raised eyebrows, the look of cold triumph on the face of the woman who had called her a thief. But more than that, it was the sensation of being reduced, of being treated not like a person, but like a disruption. For the first time in years, she questioned the value of silence. She had taught Jason to rise above, to be better, to avoid confrontation when possible. And yet, what had that silence earned her today? Not grace, not protection, only the absence of defenders. The next morning, she awoke with a new clarity. She would not forget what had happened. She would not forgive it lightly. And though she would not scream, she would not disappear either. Elsewhere in the city, the boutique opened its doors once more. Courtney stood behind the counter, recounting the prior day's events to a colleague with a smug air of vindication. "You should have seen her face," she said. "She didn't even deny it properly. Probably thought she could get away with it because she's old." She laughed. The colleague did not. Later that day, a few clips of the incident surfaced online, shaky videos taken by customers. One captured the moment the accusation was made. Another showed Ruth leaving, her face unreadable. The views were modest at first, but the tone in the comments was clear. Something felt wrong. The seed had been planted. In the coming days, Ruth would learn that dignity, when bruised, could become something stronger than protest. It could become a reckoning. And far above her, in a different tier of the city's ladder, the man she had raised was about to learn the truth of what had happened. But for now, she rested. Because tomorrow, without her knowing, justice would begin moving toward her. Slowly, silently, like dawn. The sun rose over Manhattan like a golden blade, slicing through the steel and glass of high-rises, refracting in dazzling arcs across the skyline. Midtown's towers lit up one by one, offices flickering to life, engines rumbling in underground garages, elevators ascending with morning ambition. On the 43rd floor of a sleek corporate building near Bryant Park, Jason Wilkerson stood before a wall of windows, arms crossed, sipping black coffee from a matte ceramic mug. He was a man used to motion, meetings that stacked like bricks, investors who watched every fluctuation in tone and posture, employees who studied his calendar the way others studied scripture. His mornings were sacred. A 40-minute review of overnight financials, followed by a short call with overseas teams, then a stretch of silence before the day began in earnest. But today, the silence was broken early. It began with a knock on his glass door. His assistant, a young man named Evan, leaned in with uncertainty in his eyes. "There's an issue at Cortland and Finch," Evan said. "One of the managers called. They said there was an incident yesterday with a customer. It's starting to pick up online." Jason didn't move immediately. He set down his mug. "What kind of incident?" he asked. Evan hesitated. "A woman was accused of theft. Wrongfully, it seems." Jason's jaw tightened slightly. The boutique was his personal investment, unlike the portfolio of restaurants, real estate, and e-commerce projects his company oversaw. Cortland and Finch had been his pet project, a resurrection of a fading luxury brand he'd purchased 5 years ago. He'd redesigned it, not just as a boutique, but as an emblem of quiet excellence. Minimalist, impeccable, untouchable. There were only 2 locations, one in Manhattan, the other in London. Both were carefully staffed, obsessively trained. No detail overlooked. He opened his laptop. "I want the footage, now," he said. Within the hour, a secure file arrived. 4 camera angles, time-stamped. Jason plugged in noise-canceling headphones, dimmed his office lights, and pressed play. The boutique appeared on screen, still and perfect. Display cases shimmered under recessed lighting. Clients drifted like dancers through the space. And then, there she was. He recognized her instantly. His body froze. Ruth Johnson. Mama Ruth. She was smaller now than he remembered, though perhaps that was an illusion created by the vastness of the boutique. Her steps were slow, deliberate. Her eyes wandered, filled with a soft wonder. She approached the emerald ring with a reverence that struck him in the chest. Jason stared at the screen, unmoving. The footage rolled on. He watched Courtney arrive, watched the ring exchange, watched the moments of silence that followed, Ruth's careful inspection. Then the sudden switch in Courtney's demeanor. She pulled back the ring, raised her voice, called security. Jason leaned closer. He rewound, watched again, then again. There was no sleight of hand, no pocketing, no switch. The ring never left her fingers. It remained in view the entire time. She handled it with the care of someone holding memory, not merchandise. His jaw clenched as Courtney's accusations filled the boutique. He saw the other staff watching without stepping in. Customers whispering, phones recording, security approaching with that firm, empty politeness trained into them. He watched his mother, stand accused of theft. Watched her dignity questioned. Watched her choose silence and walk away. He didn't move for several seconds after the footage ended. The laptop screen went dark, reflecting his face back at him. His expression was cold and unreadable, but inside, his chest was burning. Jason stood, straightened his jacket, and called for Evan. "Cancel my next 3 meetings. I'm going downtown." At the boutique, the morning was routine. The storefront had opened at 10 sharp. Music played low, the scent of vanilla and vetiver diffused in the air. Courtney was behind the counter, recapping yesterday's events to 2 newer associates, with the air of a seasoned soldier retelling a battlefield tale. "I told you," she said with a knowing smirk, "you have to be alert. You get all kinds in here. Some look like they belong in a museum, but they've got hands quicker than a rabbit." She was holding the real ring one moment, and the next, boom, it was something else entirely. One of the associates asked if the woman had been arrested. "Nah, she got off," Courtney said. "Didn't want to press it. But I'm watching the footage again later. I swear she did something. You don't work 10 years in this industry and not recognize a swap." The door opened. Jason entered. He wore no tie, no overcoat, just a sharp black suit and a storm in his eyes. His shoes echoed across the marble floor. The entire boutique seemed to inhale at his presence. A manager scrambled forward, his face pale. "Mr. Wilkerson, sir, we weren't expecting." "I need to speak to all floor staff," Jason said. "Now." Minutes later, the team gathered in the back conference room. Jason stood at the head of the table, laptop in hand. No greetings, no small talk. He opened the screen, turned it to face them, and pressed play. They watched. No one spoke. Courtney's smile faded as her voice echoed through the speakers. Accusations, condescension, the security guard's approach, the old woman's retreat. Jason waited until it ended. Then silence. The kind that settles in the aftermath of something irreversible. "That woman," he said, his voice even, "raised me." Courtney blinked. I didn't what?" Jason's tone was ice. "Didn't recognize her? Didn't think someone like her belonged in this space? Didn't think a black woman in her 70s could possibly afford the merchandise? No, He raised a hand. She stopped. "You judged her on sight. You humiliated her, and you did it under my name." He turned to the rest of the staff. "This isn't about protocol. This isn't about a mistake. This is about prejudice, and it ends today." Courtney tried again. "I truly thought—" "Pack your things," Jason said. She froze. "You're done here." She looked to the others, but no one met her eyes. Then she rose slowly and left the room. Jason turned to the manager. "I want a full review of every complaint filed in the last year. Every pattern, every staff member mentioned more than once. And I want a diversity and sensitivity training program drafted by the end of the week. Real training. Not the corporate check-the-box kind. Understand?" The manager nodded. Jason closed the laptop and looked around. "This brand is supposed to stand for something, for grace, for integrity. If we forget that, we are nothing but glass and gold. I won't let that be our legacy." Then he left, the door shutting softly behind him. Outside, the wind had picked up. Jason walked to the curb and flagged a cab. As he sat in the back seat, his mind drifted. He remembered her kitchen, the scent of cinnamon and soap. The nights she sat beside him with flashcards, the time she gave him $20 from her tip jar so he could buy a used suit for his debate team. He remembered the way she smiled, even when she was tired. The way she never asked for thanks. She hadn't told him what happened, hadn't called, hadn't expected him to fix it. That hurt more than anything. He gave the driver an address, not his office, not his home, her home. He was going to see her. And this time, he would not be silent. Ruth's apartment was as it had always been, modest, quiet, lived in. Jason stood outside the door for a long moment before raising his hand to knock. He had been there countless times over the years, through childhood bruises and graduation tears, birthday dinners and late-night talks. But today, there was something different in the air, a heaviness, a pressure behind his ribs. When the door opened, Ruth stood there in her cardigan, her hands still holding a dish towel. Her eyes met his without surprise. She didn't gasp or step back. She simply looked at him like she always had, with the kind of seeing that went beneath surface and silence. "You found out," she said quietly. Jason swallowed, the tightness in his throat making speech momentarily difficult. "I did," he replied. She stepped aside, and he entered. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon and lemon. A kettle whistled softly on the stove. Jason sat at the small table, its corners rounded with age. Ruth moved slowly, deliberately, taking down 2 mugs and pouring tea. No sugar, just like he liked it. She placed a mug before him and sat down across the table. For a while, they didn't speak. Then Jason leaned forward, resting his forearms on the wood, his eyes locked on hers. "I saw the footage. I saw what she did to you, what they all allowed to happen." Ruth nodded once, as though confirming something already known. "Why didn't you call me?" he asked. Her gaze softened, but her voice held firm. "You have enough to carry, Jason. I didn't want to be a burden. I didn't raise you to look backward. You didn't raise me to stay quiet in the face of injustice either." A pause stretched between them. "You told me once," he continued, "that silence can be strength, but sometimes silence is a permission. And I can't let this pass, Mama. Not this." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small box. Inside was the emerald ring, the same one from the boutique. Only now it bore an inscription inside the band, "To the woman who gave me everything." Ruth's hands trembled slightly as she opened the box. Her eyes shimmered, not with tears exactly, but with a kind of light that had nothing to do with the ring. "I had it returned," Jason said. "It was never sold. I bought it. For you. And I'm not just here to say I'm sorry. I'm here because the world needs to know who you are." Ruth said nothing. She held the ring in her palm, cradling it as though it were fragile history. Her thumb brushed the curve of the band, and she placed the box gently on the table. Jason continued. "I gathered the staff. I showed them the footage. I fired her. I'm launching a full review. And more than that, I want to tell your story, Mama, publicly, with your permission. Not just what happened in that store, but the truth about who you are, what you've done, what you've given." Ruth leaned back, her expression unreadable. The room felt full, not with noise, but with weight. History, memory, time. She looked at him not as a businessman, not as a successful adult, but as a little boy who had once fallen asleep with his hand in hers, too afraid of the dark to let go. "I don't want pity," she said, "and I don't want fame. I've lived long enough to know both can be short-lived and cheap." "I'm not offering either," Jason said. "I want dignity restored. Not just for you, but for everyone who's ever been treated like they don't belong in places made of glass and gold." He opened his laptop and turned it to her. There, on the screen, was a draft of a letter. An open statement he planned to post, addressed to the public, to his clients, to the world. It spoke of systemic bias, of the easy violence of assumptions, of the need for real accountability. And, at its center, it told Ruth's story. Not as a victim, but as a quiet architect of a man who now owned an empire. Ruth read the letter silently. When she finished, she closed the lid. "Then post it," she said. Jason exhaled. Something unspoken passed between them. Agreement, understanding, solidarity. He didn't leave right away. They talked for hours. About her days as a nurse, about the people she had cared for, the nights when the heat didn't work, the Christmases when she made dinner stretch with creativity and faith, the hard years, the beautiful ones. He told her about the business, about the pressures she rarely asked about, the loneliness of leadership. He confessed how often he still heard her voice in his mind when he made decisions. When he finally rose to leave, Ruth stood with him. She walked him to the door, placed her hand on his chest, and said, "Tell the truth, Jason. Don't soften it for their comfort." "I won't." "And make sure," she added, "that what happens next is not just a performance." He nodded. It won't be. That night, Jason sat in his office long after the building had emptied. The city lights blinked outside his window like distant stars. He opened his laptop. He posted the letter. The post went live at midnight. By morning, it had been shared 30,000 times. It began with a ripple. Quiet comments, nods of approval, tears from strangers who said they saw their mothers in Ruth's stead. Then came the articles, the podcasts, the think pieces. The boutique's social media flooded with messages, some hateful, most supportive. People demanded change. Others questioned how it could have happened in the first place. But above the noise, above the algorithms, was the truth of the letter. That the woman wronged was not simply an elder, not simply a mother, but a foundation. And that for every Ruth, there were thousands whose stories never saw daylight. Jason didn't speak to the press. He didn't give interviews. The letter was enough. At Ruth's apartment, her phone rang with messages from old friends, former co-workers, even patients she hadn't heard from in decades. One card arrived in the mail with only 4 words. You are our voice. She didn't weep. She didn't bask. She made tea and began to plan what to do with this unexpected, unasked-for spotlight. Because dignity restored is not a finish line. It's a starting point. By the time the sun crested over the East River the next morning, Ruth Johnson's name had been spoken in more conversations than in the entirety of her 70 years. Strangers posted photos of their mothers, grandmothers, aunts, women with weathered hands and quiet eyes, tagging Jason Wilkerson's open letter and adding stories of their own. The post had turned viral, not for its anger, not for its sharpness, but because of its clarity. It did not call for pity or revenge. It called for reckoning. In his penthouse office, Jason watched the numbers rise. Shares, comments, press inquiries. He sat at his desk, impassive. He had nothing to celebrate, nothing to congratulate himself for. His brand had failed. And the person it had failed was the only person in the world whose quiet pride he had always wanted to protect. He turned his attention to what came next. That morning, his head of communications entered his office holding a mock-up. "It's done," she said. "Front page of the Times, full-page ad, no logo, no promotion, just the letter, just her." Jason took the draft. It was simple, black text on white. At the top, bold and plain, her name is Ruth Johnson. Beneath it, his original letter, untouched. He nodded. Send it to print. By noon, the boutique's storefront was closed. A gold plaque on the locked glass door read, "Temporarily closed for reconstruction." Not of space, but of soul. Inside, the lights were dimmed, the display cases empty. Staff were given 2 days paid leave. Behind the scenes, policies were being rewritten, training modules torn apart and built anew. But Jason knew that paper and protocol wouldn't cleanse what had already been seen. He needed to face it. Publicly. That same day, in a rented auditorium 2 blocks from the boutique, Jason hosted a press conference. It wasn't glamorous. There were no branded backdrops, no choreographed sound cues, just a podium, a microphone, and rows of chairs, filled with journalists, community leaders, longtime customers, and employees. Ruth did not attend. That had been her request. Her story was not a prop, she had told him, and he would honor that. Jason stepped to the microphone and began. "My name is Jason Wilkerson. I'm the owner of Cortland and Finch. I'm the son of a woman who was publicly humiliated, wrongfully accused, and treated as if she did not belong in a space I created." He paused, letting the silence thicken. "That woman is Ruth Johnson, and she raised me, not as a client, not as a stranger, but as her son. Everything I've built, everything I've accomplished, is rooted in the values she taught me: dignity, integrity, and the quiet strength of grace. He went on to recount the incident: the security footage, the blind prejudice, the failure of not just one employee, but an entire system of assumptions that allowed such behavior to flourish. He acknowledged the complicity of silence, the way luxury often insulated itself from accountability. "This isn't just about one employee," he said. "It's about a culture that failed to question itself. And as the person responsible for that culture, I failed her. I failed you. And I'm here today not to salvage a brand, but to begin a transformation." He announced that the boutique would remain closed for a full month. During that time, every employee, manager, and executive would undergo in-depth training. Not a token effort, but a curriculum co-designed with ethicists, racial equity scholars, and community elders. He unveiled a new charitable initiative, the Ruth Johnson Fund for Dignity, a foundation committed to supporting elderly women of color who had faced discrimination in luxury or professional spaces. Housing support, legal aid, public storytelling grants, but more than money, it would offer restoration. "I cannot change what was done," he concluded, "but I can change what happens next." He stepped back. No applause was expected, none was offered, only stillness, and then the controlled shuffle of journalists preparing questions. Jason took them all. He answered with clarity, without defensiveness. He did not downplay. He did not spin. And when asked why he had not made Ruth the face of the new foundation, he replied simply, "Because she doesn't need to be a face. She already built the spine." That evening, Ruth sat by her window, sipping tea, as the television quietly replayed clips from the conference. She watched her son, so tall now, so poised, speaking with a calm fire in his voice. She didn't feel pride in the way others might expect. She felt alignment. The world was finally beginning to treat her truth as something real. Not a story, not a performance, a truth. Around her, her small apartment buzzed with new energy. Neighbors dropped off cards. Someone sent flowers. A former patient mailed her a crocheted shawl and a note that said, "For the warmth you always gave." Later that night, Jason arrived again. This time he brought no ring, no speech. He brought blueprints. He unfolded them on her kitchen table, drafts of the new training center he planned to build, attached to the boutique but open to the public. Workshops, lectures, story circles. A place where luxury wouldn't just be about objects, but about how people are treated. "I want you to help shape it," he said. "You don't have to run it. Just guide it. Lend it your spirit." Ruth looked at the sketches. Clean lines, warm materials, nothing ostentatious. "Call it the quiet room," she said. Jason raised an eyebrow. "That's what you called the chapel at the hospital," she explained. "The one where no one talked, but everyone came to cry or pray. Sometimes silence tells the truth better than speeches." He nodded. "The quiet room it is." They sat together long after the blueprints had been folded away. No more needed to be said. That night, Ruth didn't write in her notebook. She didn't need to. She had already spoken, and the world, finally, was listening. By the time the boutique's doors reopened to the public weeks later, the world around it had irrevocably shifted. The press conference, the full-page letter in the Times, the thousands of testimonials shared online, these had etched Ruth Johnson's story into the cultural memory. She had become a quiet symbol of resilience. A mirror to many, a reckoning to others, but not everyone welcomed the mirror's reflection. Courtney Hadley watched it all unfold from the solitude of her Manhattan apartment, curtains drawn, the blue light of her television casting shifting shadows across the bare white walls. She no longer worked. She no longer walked with the same clipped confidence that once echoed through boutique marble floors. Her phone rang less often now, and when it did, it was rarely a friendly voice. She had been fired the morning after Jason's visit, escorted out with quiet formality. No apology had saved her. No years of service had softened the edge of the decision. Her face, once poised and polished, had become synonymous online with racial profiling and humiliation. In hours, she went from respected employee to viral disgrace. But Courtney didn't see herself that way. In her mind, she had been a professional doing her job. She had acted on instinct, on a decade of training, on her learned suspicion of anyone who didn't fit the profile of an upscale client. Her mistake, if she admitted to one, was not about racism. It was about an honest error in judgment, exacerbated by the woman's age and aloofness. She refused to let herself be ruined without a fight. So she hired an attorney, a well-known, sharp-jawed man who had defended media personalities in similar cancel storms. He encouraged her to tell her side before the narrative swallowed her whole. He booked an interview with a morning show known for its fair and balanced panels. On live television, Courtney wore a navy dress and pearls. Her hair was pulled into a soft chignon. She spoke slowly, deliberately, with measured sorrow in her voice. "What happened at Cortland and Finch was deeply regrettable," she said, "but I never acted with malice. I was trained to protect merchandise, to be alert to deception. That day, I responded based on what I saw, and I was wrong. But I am not a racist. I am a person, and I have been vilified in a way that no one should be." The interviewer asked if she felt remorse. "I feel sadness," Courtney answered, "for what that woman experienced. But I also feel that I've become a scapegoat for a much larger issue. It's easy to point at one person and say, 'There's the villain,' but I acted out of protocol, not prejudice." Online, the response was swift. Some sympathized. They argued that society had become too reactive, too quick to punish, that Courtney had lost everything for a mistake. Hashtags circulated, #not intentional and #due process for all. But many others saw the performance for what it was, an attempt to recast herself as a victim, to center her pain over Ruth's, to avoid responsibility cloaked in rehearsed contrition. The clips were dissected, the tone analyzed, body language experts weighed in. Civil rights activists responded with essays. Ruth's defenders, who had been quietly monitoring the situation, reignited the campaign to hold systems, not just individuals, accountable. Then came the leaks. Several former employees of Cortland and Finch stepped forward anonymously, submitting internal emails and statements to independent journalists. These revealed that Courtney had previously been the subject of multiple client complaints, most of them involving minority customers. Instances of dismissive behavior, subtle exclusions, and condescending comments. Nothing had ever escalated to a formal hearing. The company, prioritizing discretion, had quietly handled each case. But now the pattern was undeniable. The morning show pulled Courtney's segment from its official channel. Her attorney stopped responding to press inquiries. The lawsuit she had intended to file against the boutique for wrongful termination never materialized. Her GoFundMe page stalled at less than a tenth of its goal. And Ruth? Ruth remained silent. She did not speak about Courtney. She did not comment on the interview or the backlash. When asked by a journalist at a foundation event if she had forgiven her accuser, Ruth simply said, I don't owe my forgiveness to anyone who hasn't earned it." She left it there. In the absence of attention, Courtney began to fade from the public consciousness. Her name stopped trending. Her face disappeared from thumbnails and headlines. She moved out of her high-rise apartment and relocated to a quieter neighborhood where no one recognized her. Her resume sat untouched in an inbox. She did not re-enter the retail world, but she watched. She watched as the Ruth Johnson Fund grew, as testimonials continued to be posted, as the Quiet Room, Jason's new training and reflection space, opened its doors to the public. She saw Ruth being interviewed by a small documentary team, her presence calm, her words sharp with lived wisdom. And for the first time, alone in her dim apartment, Courtney began to question not what she had done, but who she had become to do it so easily. No applause, no consequences, no awakening, just silence. And in that silence, the weight of having been seen for what she truly was began to settle, slowly, like dust after a long collapse. Meanwhile, across the city, Ruth sat beside a young woman who had just joined the Foundation's mentorship program. The girl was 21, recently fired from a cosmetics job for attitude. She had been told she didn't match the brand. Ruth listened, then smiled. "They say we're too loud when we speak, too proud when we stand, too much when we dare," she said. "But the truth is, we are exactly enough." And in that room, filled with quiet affirmation, Ruth's presence was not about a past incident, nor a public apology. It was about what came after. Not the fall, but the rebuilding. It was a gray morning in late spring when Ruth Johnson stepped once again into the heart of Midtown. The clouds hung low above the skyscrapers, diffusing the sunlight into a soft, silvery haze that wrapped the city in muted reflection. The sounds of traffic hummed beneath the surface of everything, but Ruth walked as though through stillness. The storefront of Cortland and Finch had changed. Gone were the stark gold letters etched into cold glass. In their place was a simple wooden sign with a brass inlay that read, "Cortland and Finch, home of the Quiet Room." The boutique had been reimagined, not in opulence, but in invitation. The walls inside were painted in warm earth tones. Displays were spaced with breathing room. At the far end, where once only clients with six-figure accounts dared tread, stood a door with frosted glass and a plaque. The Quiet Room. It was not a room of silence in the literal sense. People spoke there, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in raw declarations. It was a space designed not to sell, but to listen. A place where guests, regardless of background, were encouraged to share stories of exclusion, resilience, and hope. No jewelry was sold there. Only truth was exchanged. Ruth moved slowly across the boutique floor. Staff greeted her with respectful nods, not because they had been told who she was, but because they had been taught to see the fullness of a person without assumption. And in seeing her, they saw the cornerstone of the change they now upheld. Today, she wasn't here to commemorate the boutique's transformation. That had been done. Nor was she here for press or foundation meetings. She had come for someone else. A woman stood nervously near a display of silver lockets. She was thin, with salt and pepper braids pulled back into a bun, her clothes neat but threadbare. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the glass, then withdrew them. A staff member had offered to help, but she had waved him off gently, unsure. Ruth approached with the kind of quiet presence that draws people inward. "You looking for something special?" she asked. The woman turned. "I don't know if I belong in here." Ruth smiled. "That makes two of us." The first time I walked through those doors, they made it real clear I didn't belong either." The woman looked at her, confused. "But aren't you—" "I'm just Ruth," she said, "but I know what it feels like to want to honor someone and not be sure the space will honor you back." The woman's eyes welled up. "My daughter. She graduated college last week, first in the family." "That's worth more than diamonds," Ruth said. "But if you want to market with something she can wear, let's find her a piece that speaks to what she's done." They walked together slowly. Ruth guided her through the displays, explaining the meaning behind certain stones, the symbolism of designs. The woman chose a locket shaped like a teardrop with a tiny engraved flame inside. The sales associate treated her with full attention and quiet respect. When the transaction was complete, Ruth stayed with the woman as she held the box in her hand, reverently. "You helped me do this," the woman said. "Thank you." Ruth shook her head. "No, you walked in. I just made sure you weren't walking alone." That day, the quiet room held a small circle. A group of women gathered, teachers, nurses, homemakers, businesswomen, all of them over 60. Each had been invited by the foundation, not as clients but as participants. They spoke of their first jobs, the doors that had been closed to them, the voices they had been told to lower. Some wept, others laughed. Each story was received in full silence, then gentle applause. At the end of the gathering, Jason arrived. He didn't speak until spoken to, and when Ruth nodded to him, he stepped forward. "This," he said, "is the room I should have built first. Before the cases, before the counters, before the product lines. A place to hear the people we never used to see." He looked to his mother, seated in the center of the room, her back straight, her eyes clear. "We're expanding the foundation," he continued. "We're partnering with shelters, libraries, churches, offering grants, workshops, mobile storytelling booths, and we're opening another quiet room in Brooklyn. Mama, I want you to bless the space." Ruth stood slowly. Everyone else followed. She walked to the center of the room, placed her hand on Jason's arm, and closed her eyes. "May this place remind every woman who walks through its doors," she said, "that silence does not mean absence, that dignity cannot be stolen, and that what was once denied can still be reclaimed." The room echoed with stillness, rich, deep, holy. Later that evening, Ruth sat alone on a bench in Central Park. The city around her moved as it always had, impatient, indifferent, alive. But she was not the same woman who had entered that boutique weeks ago. She was not diminished. She was defined. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the emerald ring. It caught the light, soft and green and endless. She turned it over, touched the engraving. "To the woman who gave me everything." She didn't need to wear it to know its meaning, but she slipped it onto her finger anyway. And for the first time in many years, Ruth Johnson allowed herself to take up space. Not just in rooms of justice, not just in whispers of memory, but in the full, dazzling expanse of her own worth. She leaned back, closed her eyes, and let the city rush around her, unmoved, unbent, unbroken. If you found this story meaningful, make sure to subscribe for more. Watch the next video to continue the journey, and if this moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it.